Welcome, students of history, to the Royal Archives. I am your scribe, and today we're going to dive into an explainer of a man whose life was literally split down the middle. We're studying the duality of the Mauryan Empire's most famous ruler, a guy who shifted from unimaginable brutality to profound enlightenment. All right, let's look at today's syllabus. We'll be covering Welcome Students of History, the Ambiguous Ascension, the Bloodbath of Kalinga, the Shift to Peace, and finally, Judging Ashoka the Great. Let's jump right in. Welcome, students of history. To really get what's going on, we have to transport ourselves back to India around 300 BCE to grasp the immense pressure placed on the royal family. The world was expanding, borders were shifting, and the burden of leadership was heavier than ever. Think about the sheer, massive scale of the Mauryan Empire. I mean, this was the absolute largest empire India had ever seen up to that point. It was built from the ground up by Ashoka's grandfather, Chandragupta, and then pushed even further by his father, Bindusara. So you've got this sprawling, colossal territory, right? And obviously, an empire that massive desperately needs a seriously powerful successor to hold it all together. But here's the catch. Our young prince? Yeah, he was definitely not the favorite son. Actually, the archives are pretty clear on his early vibe. His brothers might have been loved more, but the royal court deeply feared Ashoka's unyielding aggression. Everyone knew one undeniable truth. Ashoka was a terrifying warrior. Even as a young guy, he was known for crushing rebellions with this brutal, zero-compromise force. The whispers about him were everywhere. He was, without a doubt, the prince nobody wanted to fight. Moving to Section 2, the Ambiguous Ascension. Now, this is where my job as a scribe gets kind of tricky, because right after Emperor Bindusara dies, the records plunge into bloody chaos. Did Ashoka truly eliminate his own brothers? Look, as your scribe, I literally have to ask you to question the official records here. Some stories insist he ruthlessly wiped out his brothers during the power struggle, but history just isn't fully clear. The fog of war and the passage of time really obscures the absolute truth. We're left guessing just how much royal blood was actually spilled in the palace to secure that crown. But hey, one thing is 100% certain. Ashoka took the throne, and his royal might was absolutely staggering. He now commands one of Earth's strongest empires. We're talking about controlling massive armies, deploying actual war elephants, and commanding thousands upon thousands of highly trained soldiers. Yet despite all of this overwhelming power right at his fingertips, one independent kingdom, Kalinga, flat out refused to bow, and that single stubborn decision would alter the course of history forever. Which brings us to Section 3, the Bloodbath of Kalinga. This event marks the ultimate psychological fulcrum of our emperor's entire life. Let's trace the timeline of the Kalinga campaign. It starts in March, with Ashoka deploying a completely giant army. Then comes the battle itself, and, well, it's just horrifying. The scale of the slaughter is almost impossible to wrap your head around. Thousands of soldiers die in the mud. In the aftermath, cities burn to the ground, and entire families are completely destroyed. The conclusion? Kalinga finally falls to the Mauryans. The empire expands, and technically the battle is won. But put yourself in his shoes for a second. Picture our conquering general walking through the smoldering ashes of his so-called victory. You don't feel victorious, right? You just see dead soldiers, crying families, and completely burned out villages. Ashoka is struck down by this massive visual disparity. He's looking at the supposed glory of empire building, but all he actually sees is sheer, devastating human suffering. And this brilliantly illustrates the exact moment the most dangerous man in India changes forever. For the absolute first time in his life, Ashoka feels guilt. Crushing, overwhelming guilt. The utter horror of this war literally breaks him emotionally. The ruthless prince practically dies on that battlefield, and a profoundly changed man walks away. So let's turn to Section 4, the Shift to Peace. The bloodbath ends, and an entirely new era begins as Ashoka walks away from unnecessary violence and turns his heart and his mind completely toward Buddhism. We really need to analyze the political impact of this massive shift. Compare his governing methods. On one hand, you have his old reality, the brutal battlefield, crushing rebellions, utilizing giant war elephants, and leaving burned villages in his wake. But on the other hand, look at his new vision, the peaceful empire. He totally abandons violence, spreads wisdom, and actively sends Buddhist teachings all across Asia. This drastic contrast shows a guy pivoting from a terrifying conqueror who terrified his people into a spiritual leader who sought to protect them. And consider how this Buddhist shift in policy actually plays out in the real world. Instead of conquering neighboring kingdoms, his new arsenal becomes infrastructure. He starts building these extensive, sprawling roads to connect his people. He constructs hospitals, and get this, hospitals for both humans and animals. He erects magnificent temples and establishes huge universities. The vast resources of the state are no longer being used for death. They're being used to cultivate life and enlightenment. It's a total paradigm shift. Finally, we arrive at Section 5, Judging Ashoka the Great. As we prepare to close the Royal Archives today, students, we have to evaluate the legacy of this incredibly complex ruler from the perspective of centuries later. I want you to think about this truth. Even the most ruthless ruler can transform. Ashoka proved something that is so incredibly rare in human history. We don't remember him today just because he conquered a bunch of land. Honestly, history is full of warlords who did that. He's remembered because he managed to completely change himself. But as your scribe, I'm going to leave you with one final, massive, critical thinking prompt for your studies. Does a peaceful legacy excuse early violent actions? Seriously, can the profound wisdom, the hospitals, and the universities of Ashoka the Great truly erase the bloody stains of Ashoka the Ruthless? It's a tough one for sure. I encourage you to debate this long after our explainer wraps up. Thank you so much for joining me in the Archives Today, students.